insurance industry create an organization that actually has a listing for every type of occupation there is. If somebody calls me and says I need workers' compensation insurance, I say, what do your employees do? They give me some information, and I call the National Council for Compensation Insurance, and they have now it's on a computer, but they have a book that they look it up in. And so they define every kind of job. So if I say, well, they do roofing, they say, okay, is it more than 2 stories in height? If so, if it's more than 2 stories, it's more expensive. If they do high-rises, it's more expensive. They have different codes for every kind of job that there is. They give us that code, and that establishes the cost you're going to pay. So with workers' comp, for every $100 in payroll, they establish a rate. And so let's take a secretarial person, somebody who mostly types, does computer work in an office. The cost right now in South Dakota is about 34 cents for every $100 of payroll to buy work comp. Very inexpensive. The bizarre thing, I was mentioning accountants before, accountants do a lot of the same kind of work as somebody sitting in an office. We'll pay about 18 cents. I don't know why that is, but the statistics have proven out that accountants are way safer than secretaries for some reason. If you get into jobs like roofing, it'll be about $15 per 100. Quite a bit more expensive than these kinds of jobs. And working with juveniles in a correction facility, the actual cost is probably $30, $35 a 100. So the insurance company says that there's, for $100 of payroll, we need $35 to take care of that risk that somebody gets hurt. Very, very high propensity to get hurt in the job. You probably wouldn't want to work in your job if you knew they didn't carry work comp, right? Let's see, I'll flip this open here a second. All right, so this gray page in here. Now this is an American Family publication, but this would be pretty standard for any insurance company in here. So workers' compensation, it says, covers statutory obligations of an employer, so that's things required by law, protects your employees from loss of income, provides payment for medical expenses due to work-related illness or injury. So what about illness? Most you're going to be too young to remember, but big deal about asbestos in schools a number of years ago, and they're still kind of working on that. When they tore down the old Methodist hospital, there was asbestos in that building they had to deal with as they tore it down. So at one point when they built all these big buildings, they don't do it anymore, but they would stick asbestos up in the ceilings because it prevented fires from spreading, which seemed like a good idea until they discovered that that also caused lung cancer. It didn't tend to cause lung cancer if you're just sitting in the building, it might, but if you stirred it up, it was really bad for you. So those employees who worked for those businesses and installed that asbestos insulation and liners and such, way later, started to discover they were getting lung cancer and other kinds of illnesses as a result of all the dust that was stirred up while they were putting it in. So illness comes along with this, and that can be all kinds of things. Coal miners with a black lung, and can be stuff you don't even know is happening at the time. Carpal tunnel has been a big one in the insurance industry. If you type all day, every day, does that create carpal tunnel? It might. No one really knows for sure, but there's been a lot of claims for it. There's been a lot of them paid as a result of that. Then it mentions payments are determined by individual state laws. Then employer's liability covers work-related injuries not covered by workers' compensation. So of those two parts, work comp shows basically anything that even if you're not liable, it's going to pay. And then if you are liable, it's going to pay anyways. So they put that all together into one policy to take care of that stuff. And by doing this, we save the individual the cost of having to hire an attorney, but we also save the employer the expense of defending themselves. And it's a fairly efficient system for taking care of things. On that last page, kind of a light one here, it shows, let's see, pays for under the medical expense number 1 covers things like prescription drugs. Mileage reimbursement for travel to medical appointments may be included. Lost income if the employee is not able to return to work or extended leaves of absence. Death benefits for survivors. So if your husband's working in a job and he falls off a roof and he dies, there will be a death claim under workers' compensation. I believe South Dakota's limit is $50,000 that they pay out. So it's not going to replace the person by any means. But it's certainly going to help the family, so that's included in there too. Rehab benefits, so that can mean going to somebody like a physical or occupational therapist to take care of things, or that might mean training you for a totally different kind of job. If you worked in a position where you needed to be very able-bodied, climbing on things, lifting heavy things, and you have a back injury as a result of your work, the insurance company has a certain amount of incentive to get you trained into another occupation. They would be on the hook for the disability payments if you can't work that job. So they may say, okay, we know you're never going to be able to do this again because of the extent of your injury. So we'll send you to college. We'll make sure that you can get a job working in an office where you can type. My wife worked at a place, it's a credit card processing facility. There was a guy who'd been seriously injured in a bus accident and had lost one eye, was nearly blind in the other one, was in a wheelchair, and only one of his arms worked. Now, he worked in a credit card processing place. When you call on the phone and say, I want to know what my bill is, I want to make my payment, he did that. And it was a result of an injury that happened. An insurance company stepped in and said, instead of paying for disability for the rest of your life, what if we put you through school? What if we give you certain adjustments to help you adjust to being able to work with your disabilities? So they paid for him to have larger monitors, special technology so he could zoom in on things on his computer. They still gave him a payment every month for the rest of his life, but less than he would have got if he wasn't working. They paid extra expense for him to get to and from work because he had to have a special handicap transportation. So sometimes the insurance company and the individual can reach an agreement and say, we're never going to get there with what you did before. We know we can't treat you back to the way you were before, but we'll find a way to give you a reasonably good quality of life and still compensate for something. So those are kind of important steps there.
To the $100,000 though, won't you?
Potentially, no, this guy worked for a place that had a lot more coverage, but yeah, it could potentially be there, and otherwise you'd have to prove they were negligent and sue them, personally.
Okay, go back to the old way.
Exactly, yeah. So it always, if you use up the policy limit, we go back to the old way, and then if they did something wrong, so if you can show, okay, failed to do something a reasonable person would do, should have known this could have happened, didn't prevent it in some way. You might find in a lot of jobs where they do very simple things to try to prevent injuries. I know a lot of factories here in town give their employees incentives for not having injuries. They'll say, if nobody has an injury for the next 90 days, we'll buy everybody lunch. Well, along with these codes, I was talking about this $100 for payroll and stuff. Okay, let's say you have a workers' compensation policy and you start to have some claims. Employees keep getting hurt. Well, you turn in a claim to your insurance company and they're going to pay the bill. But after a while, they're going to say, well, wait a minute, we're in business too. And we can't give away money, we can't pay out more than we bring in every year, and it's not fair to the rest of our policyholders. So we have to find some way to work this out. An insurance company can surcharge your work comp, they can also discount your work comp. So if you have a long history of no claims, they start to reduce your rate. If you have a long history of higher claims, they start to raise your rates. And in the private market in South Dakota, a work comp company can cancel your insurance. They can say, you're too high of a risk, you're not doing anything to address this, we're done with you. They don't do that very easily. They'll normally impose deductibles. So they'll say, well, before you can turn in a claim, you pay the first $5,000 as the employer. That's a pretty effective solution because the employer goes, whoa, wait a minute, I've got money on the line. They don't see it when it's in the premium, but when the employee gets hurt, they go to the hospital, the bills come in, and the first $5,000 needs to be paid by the employer, they start to look at, what am I doing wrong? How can we do this all safely? If you get canceled from a private insurance company, most states have what's called a risk pool. South Dakota has a risk pool. Guarantees it'll take everybody. Doesn't matter how many claims you've had, doesn't matter what kind of work you do. If you want people to rappel from rockets while they're launched off of the ground, parachute, skydive, they don't care. They'll insure you. But they'll charge you a higher rate until they get on top of it. So every time there's a claim, they look at that loss ratio and they raise the rate. And it sounds like, well, would they ever really be able to make this work? They do, and it's because of two reasons. They keep raising the rate, sometimes they get on top of it, but very often those businesses just cease to exist after a while. If they're so dangerous that an insurance company can't charge enough money to get on ahead of the claims, the rates keep going up and up and up, and eventually the business will just cease to exist. So they run out of money because they've got all this stuff going on all the time. So safe operations make a big difference. You can spend, in the private market, normally about a 35% swing either down or up for good or bad claims history. In that state risk pool, it can go as high as it needs to go. So if they need to charge you $150,000 a year, they'll charge you that. But most businesses don't want to pay that kind of expense. Questions on work comp? That's the quick analysis of it.
So if somebody comes to work or is at work and they get sick and they need to leave but they won't let them and they threaten their job if they leave, they stay there and say they had the flu and you get it, can you charge them for your lost wages and if you have to go to the doctor or something for that?
It'll pay for injuries as a result of working or illnesses as a result of working. If by being there you aggravated illness, it might, but it maybe be a hard one to collect on.